Chapter 1. A New Encounter. Louis Serrano was not like other kids. Around the age of 10, children were allowed to become Pokémon trainers and begin their adventures. Louis, however, was not one of them. At that age, Louis declined the offer to be a trainer. It wasn't because he didn't like seeing Pokémon battle. He was just never interested in being a trainer. At the age of 13, the boy grew tired of not going out on adventures. So one day, Louis decided to journey outside of his home in Flashtown. Before setting off, he double-checked his backpack with a checklist.
Hat, keys, water, snacks, compass,
he said, smiling.
all set.
He bid his mother and the family's Pidgeotto farewell and set out on his adventure, promising to be back home before bedtime.
Be careful around that bridge,
called Louis's mother. Louis signaled a thumbs up over his shoulder and set foot on what he hoped would be an eventful outing. Hours later, the child with brown hair found his way to the forewarned bridge. At first, Louis didn't see anything wrong with the bridge. But then, he turned his head and spotted a pair of Gyarados observing the structure.
Oh boy,
he said. Louis grew nervous. He knew the intimidating nature of a Gyarados and the danger of provoking them. He took deep breaths in an attempt to calm himself. The boy crouched and placed his back to the side of the bridge, concealing himself from the water-type monsters. Louis picked up a small, smooth pebble near his knee.
If I can distract them with this, I can get across.
Thought Louis.
Just don't hit the Pokémon.
In a clear and precise manner, Louis flicked the pebble over his shoulder. It arced gracefully in the air over the heads of the Gyarados and landed with a splip sound 10 feet behind them. With a bellowing roar, the two beasts turned to face the sound.
Now,
thought Louis. Louis ran, pumping his legs until he crossed the bridge. He stopped at the other side, placed his back on a tree, and caught his breath.
I'm gonna need a better plan to get back,
panted Louis. As soon as he caught his breath, Louis turned to see a vast, looming forest that crept up, foreboding, into the skyline. He steeled his nerves and took his first step towards the dark, misty forest and quietly made his way inwards. The gloomy fog of the wood engulfed Louis with its cold tendrils, sending shivers down the boy's spine. He wrapped his arms around himself, conserving the little heat he brought with him.
I don't want to get lost in a place like this,
thought Louis. The short walk felt like forever to Louis, the path almost extending with every step. Suddenly, a commotion reached his ears. He stopped walking and turned his head to the source of the sound, slightly relieved that he was not alone in these woods.
unless you want to get hurt,
a female voice demanded. Louis took careful steps toward the sound and saw two shadows addressing a third. A small crocodile-looking shape crouched fearfully behind one of the figures.
Hand over your Pokémon, twerp!
A male voice ordered. As Louis got closer, he heard the third figure respond.
Forget it.
It said with a feminine tone.
You're not getting your hands on Totodile, Hutch.
Johto!
Said the Totodile. The male voice growled in response.
It's not Hutch, it's Butch!
He shouted.
Didn't you pay attention to the motto? It's Cassidy and Butch!
I don't care.
Yelled the second female voice. Louis's vision cleared. To his left, he saw a female with tied-up black hair who wore a powder blue yukata dress and a black knee-length skirt. A Totodile hid behind the female. A movement opposite the girl drew Louis's attention. He saw a male and female duo. The girl had golden hair tied in two long ponytails, while the male had a short green haircut. Louis noticed that the duo had very dark uniforms, and just barely registered that both uniforms had a big red eye in the center of their shirts. Louis knew what group these two were loyal to.
Team Rocket?
He thought.
What are they doing here?
The two members of Team Rocket took small steps towards the female and her Totodile.
Totodile.
Whimpered Totodile,
Calm down. I'll think of something.
reassured the female. The Team Rocket members grinned confidently.
It's too late for that! That Pokémon is ours now.
The threatening girl demanded. The green-haired member of Team Rocket approached the female and her Totodile. Louis looked on in the distance, with a disgusted expression on his face. Then, he felt the urge to charge at the members of Team Rocket, causing his legs to start shaking.
I'm going to kick myself for this.
He thought. Without thinking twice, Louis charged towards the Team Rocket members, barging into the green-haired boy and knocking him into a nearby lake. The individual coughed and sputtered.
Hey, what the heck?
He exclaimed,
Leave her alone.
ordered Louis. The gathering turned their attention to Louis. His purple jacket produced the opposite effect of camouflage. The ponytailed girl scowled at Louis.
Looks like we've got ourselves a tough guy here.
She grumbled,
I said back off.
demanded Louis. The aggressive girl walked to Louis and continued to scowl at him.
This is no place for little boys like you.
She said, before pushing Louis down to the ground. Some of the contents from Louis's bag spilled out.
Hey!
He said,
Now get lost!
replied the gold-haired girl. Unbeknownst to her, the second female's Totodile was preparing to attack from behind.
She's distracted. Now!
She exclaimed. With that command, the Totodile charged towards the golden-haired girl. The boy with green hair spun to react.
Cassidy, watch out!
He cried. By the time she turned around, the Totodile rammed its head into the girl and knocked her into the water. She then, accidentally, collided with the green-haired boy,
Now! Use Hydro Pump!
commanded the female. Immediately, the Totodile spurted out a powerful gush of water toward the two members of Team Rocket. The force of its hydro pump was immensely powerful. Both Team Rocket members were blasted so far back, they were no longer visible in the dark mist.
Rocket blasting off!
Louis looked on in an amazed state.
Whoa.
He thought. The female smiled, knelt down to her Totodile, and gently patted it on the head.
Great job, Totodile.
She complimented,
Totodile.
responded Totodile. Louis noticed the items that had fallen out of his backpack. He retrieved each one and put them back into his bag.
You there.
Called the female. Louis stopped what he was doing and turned his head to the girl and her Totodile.
Oh, yes?
He replied. The girl and her Totodile walked over to Louis. She reached a hand down to him.
Are you alright?
She questioned. A nervous Louis grabbed the girl's hand and was helped back up onto his feet. He then brushed the dust and dirt off of his clothes.
Yeah. Better than those Team Rocket goons.
He answered,
Agreed.
added the girl.
I must thank you for saving my Pokémon.
She continued.
If you hadn't have shown up, poor little Totodile would have been taken away.
Totodile.
Said Totodile. Louis grinned in response and rubbed the back of his head.
It was nothing.
He said. Louis then noticed, just barely in the mist, that the girl had 2 white feathers in her hair. He assumed that a Pokémon may have flown by, and the feathers landed in the girl's hair.
You've got some feathers in your hair.
He pointed out.
These?
She said, while pointing at the feathers. The girl smiled in reassurance.
Don't worry. My tribe gave these to me as a token of recognition.
Louis raised an eyebrow.
Tribe?
He questioned,
Yes, my tribe are located near this forest.
answered the girl.
We do what we can to preserve peace and tranquility here in this part of the region.
Louis blinked twice, unsure of what to say. The girl noticed this.
I take it by your silence that you're not from this area, are you?
She asked.
Well, not really.
Responded Louis.
I live in Flashtown. I'm just traveling.
Totodile became quite surprised.
Toto?
It said. The girl looked at her Totodile, noticing the surprise on its face. She then turned her attention back to Louis.
That's quite far, isn't it?
She asked.
You could say that.
Responded Louis. A number of thoughts crossed the girl's mind regarding why Louis was traveling through these woods with the mist around.
This mist will last for quite a while. Not a perfect time to be traveling through here.
She said. Her eyesight shifted back to Louis.
If you'd like, I can bring you to our home until the fog subsides.
Suggested the girl. Louis's eyes widened in stunned silence. He never expected this girl, who he had never met before, to bring him to her home.
You sure your tribe won't mind?
He stuttered.
Not at all.
Reassured the girl.
Besides, my tribe is aware how thick the fog can be.
The boy thought for a brief moment. He looked around and could barely see the path in the forest. Realizing how hard it would be to keep going in this fog, he made his decision. Louis turned back to the tribal woman.
Okay, I'll stay until the fog goes away.
He decided.
After all, I can't really see the path.
The girl nodded in response. She turned to Totodile and signaled it to start following her. She then flicked her attention back to Louis.
Follow me,
she said. She and her Totodile proceeded to travel towards their home, as Louis followed from behind. The walk was particularly quiet, since neither Louis nor the girl made any conversation. Eventually, Louis decided to break the silence.
By the way, my name's Louis,
he said.
What's yours?
Taki. Call me Taki.
Taki?
Said Louis.
That's a nice name.
After a short time, Taki and Totodile pushed past a large bush near the edge of the forest. Louis followed suit. Then, the cold chill that Louis felt inside the woods subsided, and he smiled in relief. As the mist started dissipating around the pair, Louis saw something that made his eyes widen in shock. Taki's home wasn't a village or a field. It was a large temple that had the colors red, green, white, and some traces of gold painted on the exterior.
Wow, what a temple,
he said.
Your tribe resides here?
Asked Louis.
Of course.
Replied Taki.
This temple is a sacred place for us all. We do what we can to protect it.
A few thoughts crossed Louis's mind, especially about the temple.
So, is this place well known in Johto?
He asked.
Not necessarily.
Replied Taki. She spun around to the boy.
You see, our tribe lives in secret from the outside world.
She continued.
Not many people are aware of its existence.
What if somebody were to discover it by accident?
Added Louis.
Unless they were lost or trying to find shelter during a rainy day, we would ask them politely yet firmly to leave.
Answered Taki. Louis immediately grew worried, thinking that he may be asked to leave.
Don't worry,
said Taki.
Our tribe will be happy to welcome you. After all, you did save Totodile.
Louis sighed in relief, and they approached the entrance to the temple. Totodile walked in first, while Taki returned her attention to Louis.
Wait here,
she said. Taki walked into the temple. Louis stood, getting a good view of the scenery surrounding the structure. He then heard a noise from behind. The boy, curious as he was, turned to see what the source was. It was a Scizor, and its intimidating force swept over Louis.
At ease, Scizor.
A voice called from inside the temple. The Scizor nodded and walked past Louis, but then turned its attention to the boy. Scizor, it said. Louis had a feeling it was signaling him to come into the temple, and he proceeded to walk through the entrance. As the boy entered the temple, he stared at the interior design of the place in awe. There were extravagant and delicate lanterns hanging from the roof, their soft light permeating the room. Louis glanced down at the solid, dark wooden floorboards underfoot. He realized that the texture looked similar to the spooky and sinister forest he just left. The air inside was scented with sandalwood, and it filled Louis's lungs and relaxed his mind. He looked around and saw a number of tribe members taking care of their Pokémon. Louis warmed inside at the sight. Finally, at the very end of the temple, there was a large golden statue of a bird Pokémon. Louis couldn't believe what he was seeing. His attention then shifted to Taki, who was standing next to an elderly man that was wearing a black yukata and a conical straw hat. The man approached Louis with a friendly smile on his face.
Greetings. I'm Chief Tanaka.
He introduced.
And what name shall we refer to you as?
Louis blinked twice in nervousness. He had never met the chief of a tribe before.
Oh, Louis.
Stammered the child.
It's, nice to meet you.
Oh no, the pleasure's all mine.
Replied Chief Tanaka.
You did well, child.
He continued.
It's not every day that an unknown stranger helps save a Pokémon and its trainer.
A smile formed on the boy's cheeks. He felt honored to be thanked by the chief of a tribe.
I guess you could say I was at the right place, at the right time.
He said. The chief looked to Taki, and she smiled in reply. He returned his focus to the boy.
Well, feel free to have a look around,
said Chief Tanaka.
Just please don't touch anything, okay?
Louis nodded in reply. He started to walk around the temple, observing the current events of other members. As he was looking around, he spotted an elderly woman who looked quite upset. Louis was curious about why she was sad, but didn't want to bother her. Louis sat down in front of the gold statue of the bird Pokémon. Louis didn't know what Pokémon it was, but was still intrigued by it nonetheless. From behind, Taki approached Louis.
Here.
She said. She presented Louis with a small bowl of tea.
Oh, thanks. What's it for?
Questioned Louis.
The chief wanted me to give you this as a way to say thank you for saving Totodile.
Answered Taki.
That's nice of him.
Complimented Louis. Louis picked up the bowl, and Taki walked back to her Totodile. Louis prepared to drink the tea, but before he could do that, Louis noticed a red feather in his cup. He then looked to the chief.
Excuse me, Chief?
Said Louis. The chief turned his gaze towards Louis and walked over to him. The boy, in turn, pointed to the feather in curiosity.
What's with the feather in my tea?
He asked.
That is no ordinary feather, young one,
explained Chief Tanaka, chuckling.
That feather you have belongs to the legendary Pokémon, Ho-Oh.
Louis stared at the chief in stunned silence.
Ho-Oh?
He stuttered.
I thought it was just a myth.
Oh, it's real,
replied Chief Tanaka.
I remember seeing that Pokémon with my own two eyes when I was a child.
Really?
Inquired Louis. Chief Tanaka nodded in response. Louis gazed at the chief and shrugged. He faced the gold statue of the bird Pokémon.
Is that the Pokémon depicted on the statue?
He asked.
That's right,
replied Chief Tanaka. To say that Louis was amazed would be an understatement. He shifted his eyesight to the bowl of tea he received from the chief. Although Louis wasn't really a tea drinker, he knew that it would be rude to turn down a thank you gift like this. Louis moved the tea bowl toward his mouth and drank the beverage. Thankfully, he didn't accidentally drink the feather as well. The tea tasted quite bitter, and he almost spat it out. He covered his mouth to prevent the urge, then took a deep breath through his nose. Afterwards, he managed to swallow the tea and cleared his throat.
I'm sorry.
He apologized.
It's the first time I've ever had this kind of tea.
That's okay.
Replied Chief Tanaka.
It's an acquired taste.
Maybe it could acquire a more pleasant flavor.
Winced Louis, jokingly. Chief Tanaka chuckled in response as the boy's stomach started to churn. He heard footsteps behind him and turned his head to that direction. It was Taki and Totodile walking outside. Intrigued, Louis gazed back to the chief.
Hope you don't mind, but I might have a look around the outside of this place.
He said. The child helped himself back onto his feet. However, as soon as he stood up, disorientation and a booming headache ruptured clear thought from his mind. Chief Tanaka sensed something was wrong.
Are you alright?
He asked. Louis struggled to stand properly. He almost fell over one time, but just managed to stay on both feet.
What was in that tea?
He asked dizzily. Unfortunately, the headache grew into a migraine, and Louis collapsed onto the ground. The world began to blur in his view.
No, don't touch him.
A muffled voice said. As Louis registered this, his eyesight faded into complete, abysmal darkness.